Hello, this video is about using the conditional system in Easy Form Calculator. There are many conditional actions you can choose from, and I'll demonstrate how to use these correctly. So let's start with our first example. The first example consists of two elements. The first one being the show numbers element, which is a radio element, and another numbers element, which is currently hidden. And the first example is basically like this. If I select yes, the numbers element is shown, and if I select no again, the numbers element will be hidden. So we're now in our backend view, and we'll open up the radio element, and we'll see the two options here again, no and yes. And we have two IDs attached to these options, N for no and Y for yes. So if I go to the conditional section, we'll see that it has one conditional action set up. And the conditional action is show. The target amount is peekaboo, which is the numbers element. If self-selected ID is Y. So basically this is read like this. If we select yes, which is the ID Y, the conditional action is fired, and the counter action, which is hide in this example, will be fired automatically if this action is not true. So we don't have to add another conditional action here, which performs the counter action. So this is quite handy in many places. And before we head to our next example, I want to show you a really nice feature which makes creating conditions really easy. And this you can do by clicking the Create Conditions button. This button will create conditions for each option in this element. Or you can click on the single Create Condition button, which is attached to each option row. And I click on the Create Condition button here for yes, and it will fill out all the necessary actions here. And for example, we have this set up. Now I'll delete the conditions now, so we can see this condition in action. All right, so now the first one is blank, which is the default row. You can't delete that. But the second row was added with the Create Condition button. So you basically, by default, it selects the show conditional action, but you can as well change the conditional action to your needs. And we'll create another action for this, for the no option, to show you that it automatically selects the ID 2. All right, now this was for the Create Conditions feature. So in our next example, I will show you how to set values conditionally to another element. You can see that we have another radio element here and another numbers element. And when I select the first one, set value to 1337, it will set the value to this numbers element. And if I select the second option, it will set the value to 666 here. And this is useful if you want to manually set fixed values to other elements. A small disadvantage of this selection of this conditional action is that you can't change the value here, because every time you want to change the value here, it will fire the conditional action here. So this conditional action may only be used in some cases where you don't want the user to actually change the values you set for a conditional action here. Now we're again in our backend view, and we'll see how the conditional actions are set up in this element. So now we have two conditional actions here. The first one being setting the value to 1337, and the second conditional action set the target value to 666. And it reads like this: set the numbers element value to 1337 if the selected ID is 1, and for the second conditional action almost the same, but change the target value to 666 if the compare value is 2 here. So selected ID, I'm sorry. So we have two options here again, and we have, this time we have the ID set to 1 and 2. Don't mind the values here because they will they're not taken into calculations or conditions. And this target value pops up if you select the set action. If I select the show action, the target value will disappear again. So you will only be able to set the target value with the set action among with some other actions here, but we'll stick to the set action now. The next example deals with setting target values in an advanced way. We have two numbers elements here, how many beers you had and what you told your wife. And the first one has a spinner attached to it, which is a really nice feature for the users, so they can increase or decrease the numbers value with these buttons. And if I change the value here, it increases to 3 pence, and we told our wife that we had 3 small beers. And if I increase the value 2 times more, so we have 5 pence, we told our wife that we just had a few small beers. So you can not only transfer the element's own value, but also change it conditionally to a text value, which may come in handy at some forms. The conditional actions in this element is a bit overwhelming at first sight, but once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. So the first conditional action here is that we set the value of the second numbers element to its own element value, which is done by using this self value. It contains 2 underscore signs, then the text part itself, and again 2 underscore signs. This magic value is automatically replaced by the plugin with the own elements value. And this conditional action is only fired when 2 conditional sections are true. So if if self is visible, which is self-explanatory, and if it's the self value is less than 5. So if these conditions are true, we'll set the numbers element, we'll set the number value of the wife numbers element to our own value, which is self. And in the second conditional row here, we'll change the target value to just a few if the current value is greater or equal than 5. So what you need to know is that you can set text values to other numbers elements, but we'll open the second element now. you have to change the option isNumber to no, as well as the isCurrency option to no. This determines that by default the isNumber element option is true for numbers elements because they're mostly used in terms of numbers. But we can also disable this option so it also accepts text values. So we'll try to enable this option isNumber to yes, and we'll see that we'll try it out what happens then. Alright, we'll scroll again to our third example, and if I increase the value, nothing happens because it is not a number anymore, and the plugin will just show an empty, a blank value here. Another useful conditional action is that we can set the min and max values of other numbers elements conditionally. So in this example, we have 3 numbers elements attached with some sliders, and the receiver receives the min and max values of these 2 numbers elements. So the min value of the receiver is 2 now, and we can increase the value to 20, which is the max value. And if I change the value of the max value here to something like 80, it will update the receiver's max value, so we can increase it to 80. And the same goes for the min element. If I increase the min value to 30, we can just move the slider to 30 because its min value changed. And this is really handy in many places, and we see how this works in the conditional section here. So we have the set min numbers element open, and the conditional actions contain 2 rows. The first one is that we set the min value of the receiver to our own value, and set the min value of the max value of the set max numbers element to the min value, basically. So we can't have our max number less than our min number. And this is done by using the conditional operator blur. This is triggered when our numbers element, or when any other element loses its focus. So if I change the value here to 22, you see that the receiver doesn't receive the max value yet. And if I lose it, lose the focus, the set min value as well as the receiver value has 22 as max value set. And this is done by using the blur conditional operator. In our next example, I will show you how to set the factor of another element conditionally. As you can see, we have a radio element here, as well as a numbers element and a subtotal element, which shows the count loop value here. So if I select set factor to 1, nothing happens because 1 is the default factor for all numbers elements. When I select the second option, it sets the factor to 3 of the set factor receiver, so it's multiplied by 3 and the subtotal is 6. And if I increase the value here, you can see that it keeps the factor here, so it will be multiplied by 3 again. And this is done with the set factor conditional option, conditional action, sorry. We have two conditional rows set up here. And the first one sets the factor of the set factor receiver element to 1 if the first option is selected, which has the selected ID A, and set factor to 3 when the second option is selected, which has the selected ID B. We can also deactivate and activate elements conditionally, so they're taken into the calculations. And in this example, we have again a radio element, a numbers element, and a subtotal element. And this numbers element is currently deactivated. And if I select make a count in the radio element, we activate the numbers element, so it will be taken into the calculation routine, which is resembled by the subtotal value here, which is 3. And in order to activate or deactivate elements conditionally, I have the radio element open now. We choose the conditional action activate, which can be found here. The target element is the numbers element, and the selected ID is 2 here, which is make it count, so it will be activated when this option is selected. Additionally, we can also activate or deactivate a group of elements. And as we can see here, we have the radio element again and 2 numbers elements, which are located within the group. And this group is currently deactivated, and if I select make a count, the whole group will be activated, so you don't have to activate all single elements here. And this is done by using the activate action, but instead of selecting single elements, we can also select the group here. And you can see this if you click on the arrow on the pointer button here. You can see the highlighted element, which is the group element here. The plugin also works not only with numbers elements or radio options or checkbox options, but also with input elements. And we have in this example an input element here, not a numbers element, and a second numbers element here, as well as a third element which is currently hidden. So in order to show the third element here, we have to enter one of these values, which is either 11, 22, or 33. I'll explain this soon, but I'll show it first here. If I select, or if I enter the number 11 here, the third element shows up, which is called A. And if I change the value again, the element B is shown again. When I change the value to 22, the element A will be shown again, as well as when I change the value to 33. And this is done, as you can see here. This is the input element, as well as the 2 numbers elements here. And we go to the conditional section, and you can see that there's no conditional section set up here, because there's also a different way of creating conditional actions globally, not only attached to a single element, But if you scroll down to the end of the form editor, you can see the global conditions section here. And this is almost the same as the conditional sections that are shown in an element. And you can see that we have two conditional sections set up here. Now we have the show numbers element A if the input element contains, or in this case is in 11, 22 or 33. You can separate these values with the pipe symbol here. So the plugin looks for any of these elements, for any of these values in this conditional section. And note that we have not added a hide action because as in the first example, the hide action is automatically fired when the show action is not true. The second conditional row shows the number b when these values are not entered. So we use the not in conditional operator and choose the values like in the first conditional row separated by the pipe symbol again. Our next example deals with the selected count conditional operator. This is useful if you want to have conditional actions set up with the checkbox element and want to check for the selected counts of the checkbox element. And in this example, we have the checkbox element, a subtotal element, and another subtotal element which is currently hidden. And the example works like this. This subtotal element is only shown if the selected count of the checkbox element is less than 2. So if I select an option here, the element is still shown. And if I select another option, the selected count will be 2, and the previous subtotal element is hidden, and the additional subtotal element is shown here because the selected count of the checkbox element is 2. So if I select the third option, both elements are hidden because the selected count is neither 2 or less than 2. So as you can see, we have our checkbox element here and the two subtotal elements, and we will now look into the checkbox elements conditional section. We have two conditional actions set up here, and the first subtotal element, which is only shown if the selected count is less than 2, is done with the conditional operator selected count is less. We also have the conditional operators selected count greater than or the selected count equals. So now this option has, or this conditional row has the operator selected count is less than 2, and our next conditional action is only fired if the selected count equals 2. In our next example, we are dealing with activating and deactivating calculation routines. Calculation routines are part of the calculation system of the plugin, which allows you to handle different types of calculations or calculation routines in a modular way. And you can either modify an existing calculation or have a completely different formula depending on what is selected. So this example consists of a checkbox element, a numbers element, and a subtotal element. The subtotal element calculates like this. It takes the number of the value of the numbers element and simply adds the value 1 to it. So if I increase the value to 5, the subtotal element adds 1 to it, so it equals 6. And in the subtotal element we have 2 calculation routines set up, which we will see after I've shown you the example. So if I select the first calculation routine here, we see that the calculation changes of the subtotal element. So the first calculation routine simply multiplies the value by 2. So the value is currently 6. When I activate the calculation routine, 6 times 2 equals 12. And our second conditional routine, our calculation routine, takes the value and multiplies it by 4. So 6 times 4 equals 24. And we can also combine the 2 calculation routines. And if I activate the first routine, the value will be 48. So you can have multiple calculations and formulas in a single element. We're now in our backend view again, and as you can see, we have the checkbox element, the numbers element, and the subtotal element. We'll start with the subtotal element first and see how the calculations are set up here. As you can see, we have the default calculation here in the calculate section, which takes the value of the numbers element and adds the value 1 to it. And in the lower part, we can see that the calculation routine has 2 routines set up here. The first routine simply multiplies its current value by 2. And our second calculation routine multiplies its current value by 4. And for each calculation routine, we can assign it a name and an index value, which is generated automatically. So our index value of our first calculation routine is number 1 and number 2 for the second one. Don't mind the name, we'll get to it in the next example. So the conditional part is set up in the checkbox element. And here we have the conditional action enable calc routine index. We can also activate it by name, but we'll use the index first. And we activate or enable the calculation routine for the subtotal element if our first option is selected and the target value resembles the index value of the calculation routine, which should be enabled. So we activate the first calculation routine if our first option is selected, and we enable the second calculation routine or the calculation routine with the index number 2 if the second option is selected. And just like the previous calculation routine, which is enabled with the index value, we also are able to enable the calculation routine via its name. So in order to do this, you have to change the conditional action to enable calculation routine name. We had index previously, but we'll select the name now. And the target value resembles the name of the calculation routine, which we named R1 and R2 in this case. So the calculation routines are not activated by their index value, but by their names. So we have changed the name to R1 and R2. So you can activate them not by their index value, but by their names. In order to have a more flexible form, you can also activate or deactivate single checkbox or radio options. And in this example, we have set up two checkbox elements, and the second checkbox element has all checkbox options deactivated, so you can select any of it. And in the first checkbox, we activate or deactivate these options. So if I activate the first two, you can select the first two conditionally. And this allows you to have dynamic checkbox or radio options. And in our backend view, we have our first checkbox element with the conditions. And in order to activate or deactivate single options, you can do this with the activate option or deactivate option action. So we have three checkbox options in our first checkbox element, and we activate the other checkbox element options if our selected ID is A, which is the first option, and the target option ID of the element you want to enable is entered here. So we have RA, RB, and RC respectively. And these are the option IDs in our second checkbox element. As you can see, RA for the first one, RB, and RC. The next example shows you how you can fire a conditional action when a value is between a min and a max value. In this example, we have a numbers element with a slider attached to it, and another element which is currently hidden. And the element which is hidden should only be shown if the value is between 10 and 50. So when I increase the value, the HTML element is shown because the value is between 10 and 50. And this works with the conditional operator between. We are in our numbers element, and our conditional action is set up like this. We like to show the HTML element if the value of the numbers element is between 10 and 50. And you separate the values by a colon. So the first value resembles the min value, and the second part resembles the max value. Another useful feature in EasyForm Calculator is the conditional email recipient feature. Imagine that you have multiple forms on your website and you want to redirect them to the relevant department. For example, you have a feedback form that should be redirected to the human resources department, a booking form that should be redirected to the sales department, and a support form that should be redirected to the tech department. And in this example, we have a radio option set up where you can send the emails to. So each of these options has an email attached to it. And for security reasons, you can't, or the customers or the visitors can't see the emails behind these options. So if I select the tech department and fill out the form, the plugin looks for which value is selected and redirects the email to the email behind the options. And our email recipient option is set up like this. We have 3 conditional actions set up here. And for example, if our human resources department option is selected, HR, we have the conditional action email target, and the target value simply shows the email where the submission is sent to. So if the sales option is selected, we have another conditional action here, email target, and the target value is sales@company.com. And for the check option, the submission will be sent to the check email address. Another powerful feature in the plugin is that you can have multiple conditions for each element. In this example, we have our numbers element again, and if I increase the value to some value between 10 and 50, the HTML element is shown. But when I change the value to 30, the HTML element will be hidden. And this you can do with the multiple conditions feature. We're now in our numbers element again, and as you can see, there's another conditional row added here, which says that the conditional action should not be 30. This means that all conditional actions which are located here have to be true in order for the action to be fired. And you can add other conditions with the Add Condition button. So you can have more conditions to check for, and you can also delete these with the remove button. And by default, all actions have to be true for the action to be triggered. But you can also change this behavior in the advanced section of the conditional row. You can click on the advanced button, and the first checkbox will tell whether all conditions need to be true or if any condition need to be true. So if I select the checkbox here, you can see that it changes the text to OR. So this means that any of these conditions have to be true, so the show action will be triggered. This doesn't really make sense in this example because we are now checking if the element value is between 10 and 50 or not 30. So it will always be fired because the value is not 30 or not between 10 and 50. This concludes the video about the conditional system in EasyForm Calculator. I hope that you now have more insight about how to use the conditional actions and the conditional operators. Of course, there are many more conditional features to talk about, but I'll cover these topics in separate videos. Thank you for your time, and remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel so you'll be notified about future videos. Thanks and have a nice day.